not the actual pipeline. It's inside there. It's 4 feet in diameter. The average thickness of that steel is about 5/8 of an inch. They've got insulation wrapped around the outside of that pipeline. What you see here is the outermost steel sheeting encasement to protect it from the weather. Now, about half of this pipeline was constructed above ground. About half of it was placed below. They preferred to bury it. It tended to be safer that way. As an example of it being below ground, if you turn your attention north to that big hill over there in the distance, and note that swath of ground that's been clear cut away, that's the right-of-way easement of the pipeline. It's buried right up that hillside over there. Now, if you haven't noticed already, it also goes right back underground over here at the end of that fencing. Now, an emphasis when the pipeline is above ground, like what you see here in front of you, is an indication that it's on unstable ground, that it's on what's called permafrost. And you're going to hear quite a bit more about permafrost later on. But understand that permafrost is pervasive in Alaska, particularly in the interior and the further north that you go. Permafrost means that it is ground that is frozen solid and it stays that way year-round. It never thaws out when left undisturbed. It froze eons ago during our ice age, and even today, if you were to dig down here, 8, 10, 12, 15 feet or so, that material is frozen solid. It stays that way year-round, never thaws out when left undisturbed. In fact, it was on July 2nd of 1902 with a fella by the name of Felix Pedro. You may have heard of that name by now. He was an Italian immigrant, ironically a coal miner, that discovered gold on a little creek about 6 miles east of us as the raven flies. And it was that discovery that launched a massive stampede of thousands of folks coming up from the States and the Klondike, Canada, in search of that precious yellow metal. Now these stampeders, these quintessential Alaskan sourdough miners, would typically bring just whatever it was they could carry and nothing more. That kit would consist of a simple backpack, maybe a bedroll and a tent, a pickaxe and a shovel, a saw, a gold pan, probably a rifle of some kind, and a mule if they were lucky, working their way through this densely forested wilderness, searching for creeks that had at least the suggestion of gold in the banks of those creeks. Now, the sourdough had his act together and construct what was called a rocker box, a portable little sluice box set up on the creek bank near his campsite, literally rocking the box back and forth as a means to separate the larger stones from the smaller pieces of gold. So we've got our own prospector coming up here on the right to demonstrate to you live what that would have looked like. Occasionally, these sourdough miners would get lucky, hit the jackpot, strike it rich. Usually, however, they would lose their shirts broke. And hence emerged the reference of the Alaskan sourdough miner as being sour in Alaska with no dough to get out. It was often much more lucrative for those independent miners to instead spend their wintertime fur trapping and trading and offer their summertime services to the larger mining operations. Like what we're going to show you next here, coming up on the left. So this is what would represent roughly about a medium-sized drift mining operation, where there'd really only be, say, 2 to maybe 4 men down there actually digging. Another 2 to 4 hauling the material to and from the bottoms of these shafts here, and another 2 to 4 men up top stockpiling the material, keeping the fires burning, the equipment running, and so forth. Now, it's important to point out to everybody so you understand that the blaster and drift miners of that era would only dig in the winter time. That's for safety purposes. Again, we're talking about dealing with frozen permafrost here. If it's allowed to warm up and thaw out, it essentially just turns into a bunch of mud, and you got a great risk of cave-ins that way. So when the summer times would come, they'd seal these shafts off to keep it nice and cool down there. They'd proceed to wash through all the material that they had excavated throughout the winter. In the winter, at the bottom of these shafts, they'd have a loaded ore car or wheelbarrow, lowering one of these iron muck buckets or kibbles down the shaft. They'd unload the ore cars into these buckets, then hoist the buckets back up, run them along these cables here, like you see, all the way up to that pole, called the gen pole, where eventually the buckets would catch, right about there, and then swivel, stretch out, and dump their load. Then come coasting back down empty to bang into these logs here and be reset for the next load. Just about something anyway. Hold the tip this one. You get the picture. Stuff like that. But all winter long. And therefore these piles would get really big. So they would erect new gents holes and start new piles as they needed to for more room. By the end of the winter, there were piles of gold ore everywhere. And as that warm summer weather arrived, they would thaw each one of these piles back out again so they could wash all the gold from them. So up until about 1920, that's what these outfits around here typically look like. And notwithstanding their efforts at safety in the summertime, when they seal the shafts off to try to keep it cool down there, a lot of times they'd slough off and cave in anyway. Or, more typically, because the tunnels were below the water table, they'd often fill up with water and then freeze solid. They'd have to start all over again. It wasn't very efficient. And meanwhile, gold at that time was only 21 bucks an ounce. So these guys are pretty much just going after all the big stuff. The large nuggets and the larger flakes. They didn't have the incentives, the efficiencies, the economies of scale to go after all the tiny stuff they left behind that they called the waste gold of all things. So by about 1920, they figured all the gold around here is played out. If there wasn't any gold left here, or if there was, it wasn't worth their efforts to go get it. Well, the big boys knew differently. And here I'm referring to the Fairbanks Exploration Company, the FE Company. They came into town with what was called their Keystone drill rigs. Pile drivers, essentially. They knew that instead of digging one of those big old 6-foot shafts like that so far down to bedrock not to find anything, to instead just use a 3-inch pipe that they would pound into the ground in sections until they hit bedrock, around 200 feet. They would then pull that pipe back up out of the ground and pan the contents of whatever they captured on the inside of that pipe. That's how they figured out where all the gold was. Well, they did that extensively. I mean, there were thousands of these core samples that they then proceeded to drill everywhere, gathering up a bunch of data, compiling that data into what they called their drill log, with which they rendered a modified map of where exactly all the gold was here and the route in which they wanted the dredge to come along and dig it all up. Well, they had some challenges before they were ready to do any of that. First, they had to get control of all this land. So they took the data from the drill logs and the core samples, and they went out here and bought up 35,000 acres of all of the land that you could see in virtually every direction throughout this Gold Stream Valley. So that gave them control of the land, all right, but that was relatively the easy part. The biggest challenge was getting enough water. Placer mines require a great deal of running water, and the dredges were the epitome of that. Gold Dredge 8 by itself consumed 9,000 gallons of water a minute. 9,000 gallons of water a minute, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 220 some days of their mining season meant there was no way they could rely on some pitiful little creek or stream for that kind of water supply. So what the FE company decided to do was hire hundreds of miners to take up their pickaxes, their shovels, their saws, and their mules, and had them bushwhack their way to the tops of these hills over here, the distant north, the left of you, and had them proceed to dig, largely by hand, a giant trench that varied from 4 feet wide to 10 feet wide, and varied from 4 feet deep to 10 feet deep, largely by hand, for 90 miles. This giant trench became known as the famous Davison Ditch, and it wound its way through the tops of those hills over there just as far as you could see. It was the biggest engineering feat of its day. See, the Davison Ditch served to divert the Chattanooga River, just like the Chattanooga Choo-Choo that you're on right now, and thereby provided all those thousands of gallons of water necessary for their mining operation. Water from that Davison Ditch. They prepared this ground and thawed it out. They still needed electricity. The primary power source of these dredges was electricity. Gold Dredge 8 used 4,000 volts to run all of our electric motors, to spin the belfries and the conveyor belts and run all that gravel through her belly. They also needed electricity to run the electric water pumps to push all that water through the system. So they built their own power plant in Fairbanks. Fairbanks is about 10 miles south of us right now. They contracted with the Healy Coal Company, built that power plant, ran a giant extension cord about this big, 10 miles through the woods out here, and literally plugged that dredge in so she could begin working. There were thousands of people involved in this operation. The FE Company was the single biggest employer, the #1 contributor to the Fairbanks economy in the 30-some years they operated around here, from about 1927 to 1964. It was a big deal around here, folks. Now, as we come up to the dredge here momentarily, I want to first point out on the right a spool of power cable I mentioned a moment ago. It's 3-phase, 3-conductor. 1 foot of that cable weighs about 7 pounds from all the copper inside there. It's hooked up to the dredge right now. Of course, we've stepped it down to 110 volts. It just runs the lights and videos on board these days. So as we pull up alongside and park next to this dredge, in a moment here, I'm going to turn it over to this gal. Her name is Yukon Yonda. She's got decades of mining experience in the interior of Alaska. She's going to describe to us how all this machinery works. And then we're going to give you a panning demonstration, because soon it's going to be your turn to go gold panning. But we first want to demonstrate to you how to do that correctly. Yukon, good morning. I've got a great Chattanooga train here. Take it away.
Thank you, Tim. Well, howdy.
Howdy.
Darn good to have you here at camp with us. I am Yukon Yonda. That's just a nickname I picked up in this country ages ago. I started mining for gold here in the interior of Alaska back in 1978, and it is a real pleasure to be able to share with you some of our mining history.
To reiterate and make very clear, folks, that we have heated that panning water for you. We did not have that luxury out here, but it'll be nice and comfortable for you. On the screens now, you should see some footage. Some vintage film clips of the dredge in actual operation. It's pretty neat. 1950s. Also, as we roll by, I want to point out the big gray thing poking out the back Yukon mentioned earlier as the stacking arm, or the stacker, where the tailings would come out, and the fact that it's covered up. Again, placer mines require a great deal of running water. But in the deepest, darkest, coldest part of winter, when all the water here would freeze up too densely, they'd have to shut everything down for 3 or 4 months of the year. So they cover the stacker up, for example, to help keep it just a little bit warmer inside there, so they could extend their mining season as deeply as possible into the winter. Now, on the flip side of that, in the spring, at which point the pond here would be all iced up with 4 or 5 foot thick of ice. So they made their own custom saw, a giant electric chainsaw with a 6-foot blade designed to cut big cubes of ice out of this pond that they would then wrap with chain and haul out of the way so they could begin again as early as possible in the spring. We've got that very same ice saw on display in our main camp buildings here. You might want to check that out later on. It's pretty cool. So as we round this last corner arriving into camp, you should see some of the crew come into view to greet you. Everybody here is going to get a poke sack, even the little babies. The first one is on the house. But if after your initial panning experience you find yourself stricken with gold fever and you've got to keep panning for gold, and I see some twinkling eyeballs already. That's all right. We'll sell you extra poke sacks to your heart's content. And let me tell you, it's actually a pretty good deal. We wouldn't just sell you a bag of dirt. Now this is a reminder, you're on the C train, the Chattanooga train. Make sure you have all of your things with you. We're going to be using this train again before you see it, so make sure you have your stuff together. Let the train pull up here to a complete stop. Before those of you on the right side only. Wait for it. There we go. And now open up your doors. Let's go, Gold.
that would be worth closer to $1.5 billion. That's gazillions. Good money. Real good money. A gallon of WD-40 and some paint. You're still here. Well, if you follow your guide, they'll answer all your questions. I've got work to do. Go! Over here. Oh, good morning. Welcome to the cleanup room. I'm Lightning Shorty. And no, this ain't where the crew came to shower at the end of the day. No sirree. This here is the gold saving tables where we collected the gold. The dredge closed up for about 4 hours every 2 weeks for general cleanup, maintenance, most importantly, collection of the gold. After all the digging, grinding, churning, and soaking, just about the only thing that got down to this level was some black sand, fine gravel, and the gold. Okay, enough of the music already. But we couldn't separate the gold without some help from a mighty fine English gent named Sir Isaac Newton. Now, you all know him for his mighty fine big cooking. But he also invented gravity. Because the gold is lots heavier than the other muck, gravity pulled it down to the bottom of these sluice spots, and the water sifted away the dirt and the gravel. Then the gold could be collected. There were 3 layers of material used in collecting this stuff. The top one was the mercury trap. I'll talk more about those in a second. Next came the bristles, or wooden slats. And then underneath all that were the cocoa nuts. Now the mercury traps were rubber mats with holes in them that were filled with liquid mercury. Now there's something almost romantic about mercury and gold. When they get together in the same place, they just sort of bond with one another like Sonny and Cher. They instantly form an amalgam that sinks right through the middle of each one of these traps. That might be where they got the name for that TV show. Amalgam in the middle. When the cleanup crews came on board, only certain authorized people could get inside the sluices to collect up the gold. An average cleanup every other week yielded about 4,000 ounces of gold. In 1935, that was worth about $140,000. Today, it would bring about $1.75 million. From here, strong boxes full of amalgam were taken into town to the offices of the Fairbanks Exploration, or FE Company, for smelting. First, it was heated in a retort furnace until the mercury vaporized. The mercury was removed, cooled, and reused. Then the gold was heated to 2,000 degrees and poured into brick weighing 700 ounces. Now, there's a brick mold right there on the floor in front of you. That's 700 ounces of gold, almost 40 pounds. These bricks were then sent to mint in San Francisco by way of the U.S. Post Office at a cost of $15 per brick. All those piles of dirt and gravel outside, those are called tailings. The muck that's been sifted through the dredge and thrown away. You can still see those tailings stacked up all through the ground. And in most of them, there's still some gold there. That's why we'll be putting you to work with a pan near the end of your tour. Somebody's got to get some work done. I got an axe to finish. Thankfully, here on the dredge, stealing was never a big problem, and our safety record for serious injuries was pretty good too. Well, there was one guy who got a bad limp working down here.
Are you guys on the B train?
Here's sluice boxes. There's the trommel inside that. She didn't mention that. Well, the retort sheet. Got that a bit off.
You guys on the beaver creek?
Yeah.
Get ready to board up.
Okay.
Can we go this way? Dang it, it's an old nugget. Lure me in. Lure me in, maybe stick my head in my mind.
Every now and then when it came time to use the machine, there was something we called the dredge day. And you'd tug on those levers, and down in the gear, and we're easing up the pivot on the right rear. Freeing up the thread from the hard bed rock, allowing it to move about 4 feet per walk. Then he'd do the same thing on the other side. Oh my, it was some kind of ride. Despite the size of this rig and all its complicated looking machinery, the actual process of digging for gold is pretty simple. Since gold is heavier than most of the gravel and sand it sits in, it tends to fall and shift to the bottom of that lighter material and settle down near the bedrock. So it was real important that the winchman run the buckets close to the bedrock with every scoop. Otherwise, he might miss some of the highest concentration of gold. Now, scratching along on top of that bedrock would wear out the edge of the bucket pretty quick. Till a fella named Buckethead Louie suggested making them with a removable edge or lip. So all we had to do was replace lip rather than the whole bucket. It was a whole lot easier, faster, and cheaper. Just like both types of buckets. When you leave the winch room, you'll see some big old gears on your right side. Now those bring the bucket line, and behind the gears is a black box. That's the hopper where the bucket dumps the gravel. Most gold doesn't have the teeth to show up. It usually does, which I expect. May see with a whole bunch of rocks underneath. Because the plastic everywhere I walk, that got dumped into a rotating pump, 36 foot long, 6 foot diameter fluid. The gravel will stir around through here and mix with 9,000 gallons of water per minute. So the pieces of dirt, sand, and gravel can get separated by size. And the bigger pieces will They fell onto a conveyor belt that took them to the stacker and then out to the heating fire. The smaller pieces of gold and black sand got to the screens of the collection tape down below. And this is where my maturity comes in, which means it's time for me to bow out. But before I do, I got a little story to tell you about Ledford Fiddle. Ooh, that's it. We used to cut sticks into the soil. Hello? Anyone there? Come back.
Where the crew came to shower at the end of the day. No sirree. This here is the gold staging table where we collected the gold.
This rusty balance car, you're going to see come into view one of the very own Keystone drill rigs used by the FE company. You might want to have your cameras ready for this one. Now again, FE stands for Fairbanks Exploration. And this is the machinery they would use to help them determine where the gold was located. Right after this little orange speeder car, it's going to come into view. Looks kind of like an old prairie wagon, I suppose. With big metal wheels designed to cut through that lucky permafrost. A double-decker hinged on the right side so it can fold up and lock into position, accommodating a big pipe that they would pound into the ground until they hit bedrock. Pulling the pipe out of the ground and then panning the contents of whatever they would capture on the inside of that pipe. That was a very important piece of equipment for them. And that's just one of them too. They had a whole fleet of those things, drilling thousands of courses. And the next thing you'll see on the left, down below the ground, is a series of electric motors and belfries used by the dredge to run all that gravel through the valley. Although these will be some of the smaller ones. There's a 50 horsepower there, there's a couple of 75s, there's a pair of 150s coming up around the corner. The big boys were 250 horses. That's what they used to run the bucket line on the dredge itself. A pair of them. They're all GE, General Electric, American made. So I thought I'd go ahead and address one of the more common questions that we get out here. And that is, why did that gold dredge shut down? You know, a lot of folks assume it's because they ran out of gold. But that's not the case at all. There's still lots of gold out there, folks. There's small mom and pop placer mining operations peppered all over the interior of Alaska. It continues to be very common economic activity for us here in our state. The closest one to us is our neighbor. Immediately west of us is an active placer mine. It's been active for years. The FE company did not run out of gold. They ran out of profit. See, after the Depression era, when Roosevelt came in with the New Deal to try to stabilize our economy, the U.S. was taken off of the gold standard. The price of gold was fixed at $35 an ounce, period. That gold was nationalized, and the federal government was the only entity with the legal authority to buy and transact with that gold. So the FE company had one customer, the federal government. But meanwhile, the FE company knew exactly how much gold was in this ground. They had all the data from the drill logs and the core samples from that, from those Keystone drill rigs, like I showed you back there. And they knew exactly how much of that gold they were capable, physically capable of actually digging up in any given year. So the revenue was fixed. $35 an ounce times X number of ounces they were able to dig up in a given mining season. That was their annual income, period. It was flat. So then over here on the cost side of the equation, their costs kept going up. You know, it's pretty expensive to live here in Alaska, even today. And it's the transportation cost that really kills you. Even today, if you go online to the internet, I don't know, say Amazon.com or whatever. Whatever the price of that item is that you want to buy, you can generally double it for the shipping expense to get sent to you here in Fairbanks, Alaska. So the same was the case back then. The cost to ship up all their food from the States and their fuel, equipment, supplies, tools, and so forth, that all kept getting more and more expensive. And then their labor costs were increasing. And coincidentally, 1959, that's the year Alaska became a state. So we had a new state government entity created with taxing authority. They wanted their take too. Now that wasn't the last straw, but that contributed to the equation of these series of events that were occurring. They had to decide to start shutting things down. And they didn't shut them all down at once either. They phased them out over time. Dredge 8 they shut down in 1959. The last one was in 64. So then the next question that usually segues through all that is, well, why don't they start them up again? Gold is over $1,100 an ounce nowadays. Well, in 1970, there was an organization established that you may have heard of called OSHA. In 1971, along came the EPA. In 1979, the Mining Safety Health Administration. They don't permit dredges in Alaska anymore, folks. They're just too dangerous and destructive. Now, on that point, a lot of people have been asking me this season, well, what about that fellow on TV that fired up that dredge here? Well, I don't really watch television, but I had to look that fellow up on the Gold Rush show. And he may have bought that dredge in Alaska, but he hauled it over and set it up and he's operating it out of the Klondike, Canada, Yukon Territory. Now, there's lots of placer mines in Alaska, but instead of dredging machines, we're using front-end loaders and excavators and sluice boxes. Of course, it boils down to a gold panning exercise, but we keep all of our water contained in settling ponds, so there's no discharge into our stream. The modern-day placer miner, if they've got their act together here, is fully appreciative and respectful of the environment and Mother Nature. That's kind of it all in a nutshell, folks. We sure hope you had a nice time out here with us at Gold Dredge 8. Enjoy your stay in Alaska. Safe travels to wherever it is you call home and get back to it. Here's hoping you have a chance to see some of those northern lights. We're coming into a good time of year to do that. Of course, we gotta wait for it to be kind of dark, real dark rather, and it's gonna be kind of late. You know, later the better. They start off kind of dim usually. The deeper in the evening we go, they get more and more fantastic. So I'm talking about, 11 p.m., midnight, and beyond. So make sure you have all your things gathered up with you. Let the train pull up here to a complete stop. For those of you on the left, and I should advise you on the left side only. And now open up your doors. Thanks again for coming, folks.